Hello, dear friends. Glad to see you on the channel Stories by Peter Hub. Subscribe to the channel and enjoy watching. New York had its own rhythm. The ceaseless hum of traffic, the glow of neon signs at dusk, the restless footsteps of millions chasing dreams. For Michael Harris, a 55-year-old financial analyst at a mid-sized firm on Madison Avenue, that rhythm had long ago become background noise. His life was orderly, predictable, long hours at the office, a small apartment in Queens, quiet dinners alone. Everything began to change the day she walked into his life. Her name was Evelyn Carter. She was 40, newly promoted to senior manager, and carried herself with the grace and authority of someone who knew both her power and her charm. Michael noticed her first in the conference room. Her confidence, her poised voice, the way everyone seemed to fall silent when she spoke. She noticed him later, during a late evening when most of the staff had already left. "Still here?" she had asked with a teasing smile, pausing at his desk. Michael, startled, had looked up from his spreadsheets. "Numbers don't sleep," he answered awkwardly. That was the beginning. At first, their encounters were small, shared coffee breaks, quiet conversations in the elevator, the occasional exchange of inside jokes during long meetings. But New York nights had a way of erasing boundaries. One evening, after a company celebration, Evelyn invited him for a drink at a quiet bar downtown. The lights were dim, the music soft, and somewhere between laughter and confessions, their hands brushed. For Michael, it was as if the years of solitude melted away. For Evelyn, it was a spark, but one wrapped in layers of something far more complicated. That night, Michael walked her home. He didn't expect her to lean in, didn't expect the kiss under the yellow streetlight. But when it happened, it filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in decades. He thought it was the beginning of something real. But in Manhattan, under the glitter of cold lights, not everything is what it seems. The following weeks became a blur of late-night emails and stolen moments. Evelyn's office door would remain slightly ajar when everyone else had gone, and Michael would find excuses to pass by. Sometimes it was a question about projections, sometimes a file he claimed needed her signature. More often than not, it ended with them leaning close, their conversations drifting away from numbers and into stories of their lives. Evelyn spoke of her ambitions, her struggles in climbing the corporate ladder, the constant need to prove herself in a world where men twice her age still looked down on her. Michael listened, drawn in not only by her words but by the vulnerability she rarely showed in front of others. One rainy night she confessed, "You make me feel seen, Michael, not as a manager, not as someone people expect things from, just me." For Michael, those words were an anchor. For years he had lived in quiet shadows, and now someone like Evelyn was pulling him into the light. Their romance remained a secret. A few curious glances in the office hinted that not everyone was blind, but New York was a city built on secrets, and under those secrets, Michael felt alive again. Yet, beneath Evelyn's charming smiles and whispered promises, there were flickers, moments of distance, phone calls she cut short, questions she never fully answered. Michael noticed, but love has a way of silencing doubts. By the time their romance passed the one-year mark, Michael had begun to weave dreams he hadn't allowed himself before. He imagined moving in together, imagined dinners where they wouldn't need to hide, weekends in the Hamptons, maybe even marriage. For the first time in decades, he dared to hope. But Evelyn's behavior grew unpredictable. At times she was warm, affectionate, pulling him into a world of whispered plans and sweet promises. At other times, she was distant, unreachable and cold, blaming work pressure, family matters, or simply shutting the door with a tired smile. One evening, as Michael waited for her in their usual bar, she arrived an hour late, her hair damp from rain, her eyes sharp. "I told you not to wait for me," she snapped before softening her tone. "It's just, things are complicated right now." "Complicated how?" Michael asked gently, reaching for her hand. Evelyn pulled away. "Just trust me." Michael nodded, swallowing the unease rising inside him. Trust was all he had to give. Yet, as he walked her home that night, he couldn't ignore the sensation that something in their foundation had begun to crack. What he didn't know was that those cracks would soon tear his world apart. The pressure at the office grew heavier. Deadlines multiplied, audits loomed, and Evelyn seemed increasingly tense. Michael tried to help, often staying late to review numbers, to balance projections, to make sure every line matched. But soon he noticed small inconsistencies, figures altered in reports he hadn't touched, mistakes that looked deliberate. One afternoon, during a tense meeting with senior executives, Evelyn presented a quarterly summary. To Michael's shock, several of the errors carried his signature. He opened his mouth to object, but Evelyn's quick glance silenced him. She brushed past the flaws with polished confidence, leaving him simmering in silence. Later that evening, Michael confronted her. "Those weren't my numbers. You know they weren't." Evelyn sighed, leaning against her desk. "Michael, sometimes mistakes happen. Don't be so sensitive." "They had my signature," he pressed. She met his gaze without flinching. "Maybe you should be more careful." It was the first time Michael saw the mask slip, the charm replaced by cold calculation. As he left her office that night, a chill settled in his chest. He wanted to believe in love, but reality was beginning to reveal a darker picture. In the weeks that followed, the errors multiplied. Documents Michael had never touched appeared on his desk with his name attached. Senior managers began questioning his reliability, whispering in corridors, watching him with narrowed eyes. Evelyn, meanwhile, played the role of the concerned superior, offering Michael sympathetic looks in meetings while subtly pointing out his mistakes. One morning, he was called into the director's office. "Michael, we've noticed a pattern," the director said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of flawed reports, each signed with Michael's name. "This is unlike you, but we can't ignore it." Michael clenched his jaw. "I didn't make those errors. Someone else is tampering with my work." The director's brows furrowed, but doubt lingered in his eyes. "Be careful, Harris. We can only protect you for so long." Michael left the office with his pulse pounding. He knew who was behind it, but proving it would be another matter. Evelyn was meticulous, careful, always one step ahead. That night, sitting in his small apartment with only the hum of the city outside his window, Michael realized something chilling. The woman he loved was dismantling his career piece by piece, and if he didn't act soon, everything he had built would collapse. Michael's instincts sharpened. He began saving copies of every report, every draft, keeping timestamps and backups on a personal drive. He stopped leaving documents unattended on his desk. If Evelyn wanted to frame him, she would have to work harder. He also started to watch. Small details emerged. Evelyn lingering near his office when he wasn't there, files slightly shifted, her assistant avoiding eye contact after long visits to Evelyn's desk. Michael didn't confront her, not yet.
Instead, he played the part of the weary, careless man everyone believed he was becoming. At night, he reviewed his records meticulously. The discrepancies grew clear. Numbers Evelyn had altered could be matched against his originals. Slowly, carefully, he was building a case, not just for his own innocence, but against her. Still, the cost weighed heavy. The late nights left him exhausted, and the loneliness cut deeper now that love had curdled into suspicion. Once he had thought Evelyn's presence was a gift. Now it was a shadow that threatened to consume him. But Michael had survived too much in life to surrender. This time he would not be destroyed quietly. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. A quarterly review meeting was scheduled, one attended not just by the directors, but by several external auditors. Evelyn, as usual, was in charge of presenting the department's reports. Michael knew this was the moment. The night before the meeting, he prepared meticulously. He organized his records, highlighted the altered numbers, and printed copies that traced the changes back to Evelyn's logins. It was a gamble. If it failed, he would be ruined. But if it worked, the truth would finally emerge. The next morning, as Evelyn spoke confidently to the room full of executives, Michael waited. When she displayed a chart with glaring discrepancies, he stood. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady, though his heart pounded. "I need to clarify something." The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward him. Evelyn's smile faltered. Michael handed the auditors a folder. "These are the original numbers, backed up with timestamps. They were altered later, and not by me." Whispers spread through the room as the auditors flipped through the pages. Evelyn tried to interject, but Michael pressed on. "Every change matches her login credentials. Every mistake tied to my name was planted. I trusted her, and she tried to destroy me." The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn's mask slipped completely, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. For the first time, the entire office saw the truth.
The collapse came swiftly, like a skyscraper crumbling after a single critical strike. Evelyn had built her reputation on poise, precision, and power, but once Michael revealed the truth, those foundations cracked beyond repair. In the days that followed, the office became an echo chamber of whispers. Colleagues who once admired Evelyn now avoided her gaze. Executives no longer greeted her with respect, but with suspicion. The weight of her deception was too great to hide. Michael, meanwhile, moved through the days with quiet composure. He had defended his name, but it felt less like victory and more like the closing of a chapter written in ashes. Every corridor reminded him of her laughter, every conference room of their secret glances, yet now those memories were poisoned. On Friday afternoon, Evelyn was called into the director's office. No one knew what was said behind that heavy oak door, but when she emerged an hour later, her expression was drained, her steps heavy. By Monday morning, her office was empty. Her nameplate, once polished and proud, was gone without a trace. Michael stood at his window that evening, the city stretching endlessly before him, alive and indifferent. The neon signs flickered, the taxis honked, the world kept spinning as if nothing had happened. But inside, he felt the hollow weight of disillusionment. Pouring himself a drink, he sat on his worn couch and whispered into the silence. 2 years of love, and yet nothing was real. He raised the glass as if to toast the ghosts of what had been, to lessons learned the hard way. The thought of staying at the firm felt unbearable. Though his name was cleared, the walls themselves carried shadows of betrayal. He realized with quiet clarity it was time to leave.
Time to build something that was his, untouched by lies and manipulation. For the first time in years, Michael felt the faint stirrings of freedom, fragile, uncertain, but real. From the ashes of the romance, a new fire would rise.
The days following Michael's departure from the corporate tower felt like stepping into an unfamiliar world. For the first time in decades, his mornings were not dictated by rigid schedules, hollow meetings, or Evelyn's shadow lingering over him. Instead, he woke to silence, silence filled with possibility. At first, it was disorienting. He sat by the window of his modest apartment, watching the sun rise over the jagged skyline of New York, asking himself the question, what now? He scribbled into his worn leather notebook, jotting scattered thoughts about business ideas, skills he could offer, problems that needed solving in the city he knew so well. One evening, while sipping coffee at a small cafe tucked away in Greenwich Village, Michael overheard two young entrepreneurs discussing their frustrations with consulting firms, the lack of honesty, the bloated fees, the empty promises. A spark lit within him. He had seen those same frustrations play out over decades of office life. He knew how to do it differently, better. The idea grew roots quickly. He began drafting a plan for his own firm, lean, sharp, transparent, a company that would value people over politics, results over illusions. He poured his energy into research, late nights fueled by determination and black coffee. His apartment transformed into a war room, papers stacked high, charts taped to the walls, the faint buzz of his laptop echoing long into the night. The more he worked, the more alive he felt. The wounds Evelyn had left were still there, but they no longer bled. Instead, they hardened into resolve. She had tried to break him, but in doing so, she had freed him from complacency. He realized now that love, betrayal, and pain could all serve as fuel if he chose to burn them the right way. On a cold Monday morning, Michael signed the lease for a small office downtown. The space was bare, just white walls and an old wooden desk, but to him it was a cathedral of second chances. He placed his parents' photo on the desk, set down his notebook, and whispered to himself, "This is where it begins." Michael handed in his resignation a week later. The office buzzed with shock. Hushed conversations circling like restless bees. Some colleagues approached him quietly, shaking his hand, offering words of admiration cloaked in sympathy. Others kept their distance, wary of being drawn into the storm Evelyn had left in her wake. Evelyn herself avoided him entirely. The once fearless woman now walked the halls with lowered eyes, her authority crumbling day by day. Management had stripped her of major responsibilities, and whispers about her integrity spread through every corner of the company. But Michael felt no satisfaction, only a profound sense of release. On his last day, he packed his things into a single box. A photo of his parents, a worn leather notebook, a handful of pens, no trophies, no framed certificates, just the essentials. The office that had once been a theater of passion and conflict now felt like a cage he was finally free to leave. As he exited the building, a cold New York wind whipped down the avenue, tugging at his coat. For a brief moment, he paused on the sidewalk, staring up at the glass tower where he had given so much of his life. The city roared around him, taxis honking, voices shouting, the pulse of possibility in every corner. Michael drew in a deep breath, tasting freedom. The weight that had anchored him for years, the affair, the betrayals, the endless grind of office politics, slipped away. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also opportunity.
His mind was already racing with ideas, fragments of dreams he had long buried beneath duty and desire. He didn't look back again. The tower faded behind him as he stepped into the flow of the city, ready to build something of his own.
Word of Harrington Consulting's steady rise began to ripple through New York's financial circles. At first, it was nothing more than curiosity, a small firm taking clients from long-established giants. But soon, curiosity turned into quiet respect. Competitors who once dismissed Michael as a relic now watched with wary eyes as his name appeared in conversations they hadn't expected to hear it in. His team grew in skill and confidence. The young analyst he had hired began producing reports so sharp they caught the attention of industry leaders. The single mother, whose loyalty had been forged through years of being underestimated, became the backbone of client relations, her ability to read people turning meetings into victories. Even his old friend found new purpose, handling negotiations with the kind of grit only hardship can teach. Michael thrived not on flashy deals, but on precision. Every move was calculated, every contract reviewed with care. He knew how fragile success could be, and he refused to let ambition blind him as it once had with Evelyn. Still, whispers of her name occasionally reached him. Evelyn had been struggling since her dismissal. Some said she was bouncing between firms, others claimed she was trying to start over entirely. Michael never sought the details, but when her name arose, he couldn't help but feel a sharp pull in his chest, not of longing, but of memory. She had been a chapter, and he had turned the page, yet the ink still lingered. One evening, as his firm secured its second major contract, Michael stood by the office window, watching the lights of the city stretch into the distance. His reflection stared back at him. Older, perhaps a touch wearier, but undeniably stronger. He thought of how far he had come since those dark nights on the cold couch, when betrayal had been his only companion. The scars were still there, but they were no longer wounds. They were maps, reminders of the journey. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the story with Evelyn was not finished. Threads left untied had a way of resurfacing, especially in a city where paths crossed like tangled wires. For now, though, he let the thought drift away, choosing instead to savor the rare taste of quiet victory. The first weeks in Michael's new office were quiet, almost too quiet. But beneath that silence lay momentum. He worked tirelessly, crafting presentations, building a website, reaching out to old contacts with carefully worded messages that balanced humility and confidence. He knew the city was ruthless, but he also knew it respected resilience. At first, the responses were slow. Some ignored him, others sent polite rejections, but a handful remembered his sharp insights from boardroom meetings past, the way he could cut through noise and pinpoint solutions. One client turned into 2, then 5. Slowly, a foundation formed. Michael refused to mimic the bloated firms that had suffocated the market. He kept his team small, hiring only those who shared his hunger. A young analyst from Queens, a single mother who had been overlooked by corporate giants, and an old friend from his early days who still carried loyalty in his bones. Together, they became a unit, bound not by titles, but by trust. Every victory, no matter how small, felt monumental. The day his firm landed its first major client, Michael stood in that bare office with his team, sharing pizzas straight from the box, laughing like a man who had finally reclaimed something that was stolen from him. Yet, amid the victories, thoughts of Evelyn sometimes returned, uninvited. He pictured her somewhere across the city, perhaps still in that high-rise office, still weaving lies, still chasing power. And though a part of him still carried the ache of what they had shared,
He felt the scales shifting. The pain no longer owned him. His work, his people, his purpose, these were the things that mattered now. One evening, as he locked up the office, Michael paused to look at the sign on the door. Harrington Consulting. His name. Bold and steady. It wasn't just a firm, it was proof. Proof that he had survived. Proof that betrayal could be rewritten into legacy.
For 3 days, Michael kept the note in his desk drawer, untouched. Each morning, when he sat down to review contracts or answer calls, his eyes would flicker toward it, a silent reminder of unfinished business. He told himself it didn't matter. Evelyn was his past, and the past had no place in the empire he was building. Yet the note gnawed at him like an unanswered question. On the 4th evening, curiosity overcame discipline. He dialed the number scrawled faintly on the back of the paper, an unlisted cell. She picked up on the 2nd ring. "Michael?" Her voice was low, almost hesitant. "Thank you for calling." He said nothing, waiting. "Please," she continued after a beat, "meet me. Just once. There are things you don't understand. Things I need to say." Michael leaned back in his chair, staring out of his office window at the glowing skyline. Part of him wanted to hang up. Another part, the part that had spent 2 years entangled with her lies, wanted answers, if only to close the book for good. "Where?" he asked finally. "Tomorrow, Bryant Park. Noon. The benches near the carousel." He hesitated, then agreed. The next day was brisk, the kind of late autumn chill that bit through wool coats. Michael arrived early, scanning the park. Children chased pigeons, office workers ate hurried lunches, tourists snapped photos. Ordinary life carried on, unaware of the private battlefield he was about to step into. Evelyn appeared exactly on time. She wore a long beige coat, her hair tied back, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Michael saw not the woman who betrayed him, but the colleague who once made him laugh during endless meetings. The illusion faded quickly. "Thank you for coming," she said, sitting beside him. He folded his hands, silent. "I owe you the truth. Back then, in the office, I thought I could control everything. The reports, the whispers, even you. But it spiraled. I lost myself, Michael, and I lost you in the process." Michael's jaw tightened. "You didn't lose me. You threw me away." Her eyes glistened, but she held his gaze. "I regret it every day." For a long moment they sat in silence, the carousel music faint in the background. Michael could feel the weight of her words, but he also felt the weight of his own scars. This meeting wasn't about rekindling, it was about reckoning. Finally, he stood. "Evelyn, whatever you're searching for, it's not here. You made your choices, and so did I." Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Michael turned and walked away, the note still folded in his pocket, not as a keepsake, but as proof that some chapters end without closure.
The firm continued to grow, and with growth came invitations. Charity galas, networking dinners, and high-profile panels where Michael was suddenly seen as a voice worth listening to. He attended them not for vanity, but for strategy. Each connection was a stepping stone, each handshake a calculated move. Still, amidst the glitter and polite conversation, he often found himself reminded of another time, when Evelyn used to walk into the office with her poised smile and hidden lies. It was during one of those events, a fundraiser at a midtown hotel, that he heard her laugh. The sound froze him in place. Michael turned, and across the room, Evelyn stood, elegant as ever, her black dress catching the dim light, her hand resting casually on the arm of a man he didn't recognize. Their eyes met for only a moment, but it was enough. Old emotions stirred, though dulled by time and distance. He nodded politely, and she responded with the faintest of smiles, a smile that carried no warmth, only recognition. For the rest of the evening, he caught glimpses of her in the crowd, speaking animatedly, tilting her head the same way she used to in meetings. She seemed changed, and yet entirely the same. Memories tugged at him, but Michael forced himself back into the present. He had no desire to fall into old traps. The man she had been to him was a lie, and lies had no place in his new life. When the event ended, he left quickly, stepping into the crisp New York night. The city hummed with life, taxis streaming by, neon lights reflecting off wet pavement. He took a deep breath, letting the cold air clear the ghosts lingering in his mind. Evelyn was part of his past, and the past had already taken enough from him. Yet, as he walked toward his car, a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper caught his attention. Curious, he pulled it free. In neat handwriting were just 4 words. "We need to talk." No signature, no explanation, only the faint scent of her perfume lingering on the page. Michael stared at it for a long moment, then slipped it into his coat pocket. He didn't know whether it was a trap, a plea, or something in between. All he knew was that the past had found him again.
Back in his office, Michael felt lighter than he had in years. Meeting Evelyn had not reopened wounds, it had sealed them. He realized that the strength he carried now was born not only of ambition, but of survival. He had endured betrayal, humiliation, and loneliness, and turned them into fuel. His company was thriving. Contracts flowed steadily, and word of his integrity in the industry spread faster than any marketing campaign. Clients respected him not only for his sharp mind, but for the quiet authority he exuded. Every victory tasted sharper because of what he had lost. One evening, after a long day of negotiations, he stayed late in the office. The city buzzed outside, its neon heart beating against the glass walls. Michael poured himself a glass of scotch and sat at his desk, reflecting. For the first time in decades, he felt not like a man chasing something, but a man who had arrived. And yet, in the stillness, he admitted something to himself. Evelyn had not been the end of his story. She had been a test, a brutal lesson written into his life. The real story was just beginning. He leaned back, lifting his glass toward the skyline. "To new chapters," he murmured. Just then, his phone buzzed with a message from one of his senior partners. "Big opportunity on the horizon. Call me first thing tomorrow." Michael smiled. The world was finally opening its doors to him. The following week unfolded in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and negotiations. Michael threw himself deeper into work, as though each signed contract could stitch closed the wounds Evelyn had left. Success had become not just a pursuit, but a shield, and he wielded it fiercely. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when the city lights painted faint reflections on his apartment windows, he would remember the way she had raised her hand across the street. That gesture, hesitant, almost vulnerable,
haunted him. What had she wanted to say? Was it apology, regret, or just another attempt to weave herself back into his life? He would never know, because he had walked away. And still, doubt gnawed at him. Had he chosen strength or cowardice? He reminded himself that he had built everything without her, that the fire she started in him had burned away weakness. He no longer needed her validation, yet the shadow remained, clinging stubbornly like a scar. At the office, whispers began circulating. Rumors of Evelyn's dismissal from her previous company had reached the industry. Words like sabotage, falsified reports, and ethics investigation floated through the air. Michael listened quietly, never confirming nor denying his connection to the story. He let others talk, while he stayed silent, his composure unreadable. One evening, after a particularly long day, Michael stood at the window of his office, gazing down at the river of lights on Fifth Avenue. The world had shifted so far from the life he once had. The small cubicle, the fleeting romance, the fragile hope of happiness. Now he stood at the helm of something far greater. And yet, as his reflection stared back at him in the glass, he whispered words only he could hear. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought against memories, not people. With that, he turned off the lights, leaving the office in darkness, and stepped out into the night, determined to carry his story forward no matter what ghosts lingered behind.
The following morning, Michael woke with an unusual energy. He had barely slept, but the prospect of the opportunity waiting for him was enough to keep fatigue at bay. As he arrived at the office, the city still damp from last night's rain, the skyscrapers gleamed in the pale light of dawn. He stepped into the lobby of his building, greeted by familiar faces who now looked at him with admiration, not pity. His rise was undeniable. In the boardroom, the meeting stretched for hours. A merger with a European firm, bold, risky, but immensely rewarding if handled correctly. Michael listened, asked sharp questions, and made decisions with the confidence of someone who had carved his empire from stone. His partners trusted him implicitly, his leadership steadying the room like an anchor. But amid the figures and proposals, he caught himself staring at the glass of water in front of him. For a brief moment, Evelyn's face flashed in his mind, the way she used to glance at him across the office, disguising affection with professionalism. It stung less now, but the shadow of what once was still lingered. He pushed the memory away. There was no time for ghosts. That evening, leaving the building, Michael noticed a familiar silhouette waiting across the street. His breath caught. The hair was different, shorter, but the stance, elegant, deliberate, was unmistakable. Evelyn. She stepped forward, hesitation in her eyes, as if unsure whether to cross the street. Michael froze, torn between curiosity and resentment. The city roared around them, horns blaring, neon lights flickering, but for that instant, it felt like the world had fallen silent. Evelyn raised a hand, almost timidly, as though asking permission to approach. Michael's heart clenched, but he did not move. He knew this moment would come, perhaps not here, perhaps not now, but inevitably. The past had a way of circling back. Slowly, deliberately, Michael turned and walked toward his car. He didn't look back. The winter chill had settled heavily over New York. frosting the sidewalks and making every breath curl into the air like fleeting smoke. Michael walked briskly through the city, his overcoat drawn tightly around him. Yet the cold he felt was not of the season, but of something deeper. The memories of Evelyn, the battles fought and won, still pulsed in his chest like a wound that refused to heal. At the office, momentum had reached a peak. Deals were closing faster than he could track, new clients were signing on daily, and his small firm had become a name that others in the industry could no longer ignore. Competitors eyed him with wary respect, some with open envy. Michael, however, remained grounded, even aloof. He had learned the dangers of trust, the fragility of illusions. His focus was singular: build something that could never be stripped away from him. But with every stride forward came the faintest echoes of the past. Whispers of Evelyn's downfall now spread beyond their old office and into the wider corporate circle. Some spoke of her bitter attempts to regain footing. Others hinted at reckless choices she had made since her dismissal. Each rumor was a shard of glass in Michael's conscience, sharp, gleaming, and impossible to ignore. One late evening, after most of his staff had gone home, he sat alone at the long boardroom table. The city glowed beneath him, but inside the room only silence reigned. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes heavy. Success had filled his life, but so too had an emptiness he couldn't define. The victory over Evelyn had come at a price. He had proven his strength, but he had also proven his solitude. The phone buzzed on the table, a message flashing briefly across the screen. He glanced at it, then looked away just as quickly. It was nothing. A reminder of a meeting, a notification about numbers, something trivial. Yet the sudden urge to see her name there unsettled him. 2 years together had bound invisible threads that, though severed, still tangled in his mind. Michael rose from his chair and crossed to the tall windows. Outside, snow began to fall, each flake catching the light of the city. For a fleeting moment, he thought of what it would have been like to share this view with someone, to breathe in the quiet together. But that was not his life anymore. His story had moved beyond the fragile stage of yearning. Now he was writing it with his own hand, his own will, and no one else's lies could shape it. And yet, as he turned away from the window, Michael knew one truth remained. The reckoning was not with Evelyn, not with the office, not with the industry. It was with himself, with the silence he carried, with the loneliness that success could not erase.
The following weeks unfurled with a rhythm Michael had not anticipated. His firm, once the humble venture of a man scorned, was now at the center of conversations across New York's corporate circles. Newspapers had begun to take note, publishing small but telling columns about the rise of a company built on resilience and precise execution. Michael found himself invited to panels, lunches, and interviews. The world finally recognized his worth. Yet recognition was not the balm he once thought it might be. On a crisp Thursday morning, as he exited a midtown conference hall, a familiar figure waited near the entrance. Evelyn. She was dressed impeccably, as always, but time and turmoil had carved faint lines around her eyes. Her posture wavered between confidence and desperation, as though she could not decide whether to stand as his equal or plead for his forgiveness. "Michael," she called softly, her voice almost lost in the rush of passing traffic. He stopped, a heaviness settling in his chest. For a brief moment he considered walking past her, as though she were just another face in the crowd. But instead he paused, letting her approach. "I owe you an apology," Evelyn began, her tone stripped of the arrogance it once carried. "I was cruel, dishonest. I tried to destroy you when I should have admired you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I couldn't move forward without saying this." Michael studied her carefully. The woman before him was not the one he had once loved, not the vibrant, confident leader who had captivated him years ago. This Evelyn was smaller, worn down by choices that had collapsed beneath their own weight. Still, there was something hauntingly familiar in her eyes, something that tugged at the remnants of his old affection. "You know," Michael said, slowly, his voice measured, "for a long time I thought I hated you. But it wasn't hate, it was grief. I grieved for the man who trusted too much, for the time I lost believing in lies, and I grieved for the woman I thought you were, the one who never really existed." Evelyn's gaze faltered, and for the first time she had no retort, only silence. "I've built something out of that pain, and I've learned that when you love someone, you sometimes have to endure in silence. But you were never the person I was meant to endure for." Her lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. Instead, she reached out, her hand hovering in the cold air between them. Michael did not take it. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb. His driver stepped out, opening the door. Michael gave Evelyn one final look, not with anger nor longing, but with the quiet finality of a man who had learned to let go. "Goodbye, Evelyn," he said, and with that he slid into the car. The door shut with a soft thud, sealing the chapter. As the car merged into traffic, Michael leaned back against the leather seat. He thought of the nights he had spent alone, the silent lessons learned on a worn-out couch in a darkened room. Those nights had been his crucible, shaping him into someone stronger, sharper, unshakable. Now the city stretched out before him like a canvas waiting to be filled. For the first time, the echoes of Evelyn's presence no longer bound him. They had become just that, echoes, fading into the distance, replaced by the steady beat of his own resolve.
The night after his encounter with Evelyn, Michael stood by the window of his apartment overlooking the city. Manhattan pulsed with its usual restlessness. The flickering lights, the muted hum of traffic, the endless churn of ambition. But for once, he felt no weight pressing down on him. The ties that had bound him to the past were cut. He was no longer a man living in the shadow of betrayal, but someone stepping firmly into his own future. Days bled into weeks, and Michael poured himself into his company with renewed clarity. His leadership was now tempered by the hard-earned lessons of trust and disillusionment. Employees admired him not only for his vision, but for the quiet resilience he carried. His firm became a sanctuary for those who sought honesty in a world that often traded in masks and hidden daggers. But for once, he felt no weight pressing down on him. The ties that had bound him to the past were cut. He was no longer a man living in the shadow of betrayal, but someone stepping firmly into his own future. Days bled into weeks, and Michael poured himself into his company with renewed clarity. His leadership was now tempered by the hard-earned lessons of trust and disillusionment. Employees admired him not only for his vision, but for the quiet resilience he carried. His firm became a sanctuary for those who sought honesty in a world that often traded in masks and hidden daggers. Yet when the world looked at him now, they did not see a man broken by love. They saw a builder,
someone who had taken shards of a failed romance and arranged them into a foundation strong enough to hold an empire. One evening, after closing a significant deal, Michael walked through Central Park. The crisp air carried the scent of autumn leaves, and laughter from nearby joggers and families filtered through the night. He found a bench and sat down, staring up at the skyline. The loneliness he had once felt on that cold couch in his darkest hours was gone. In its place was a profound stillness, the kind born not of emptiness, but of acceptance. He pulled out his phone and glanced at a message draft he had typed weeks ago, addressed to Evelyn, but never sent. 4 simple words glowed on the screen. "I forgive you." Finally. With a quiet smile, he deleted it. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't something she needed to hear. It was something he had already given himself. As he rose from the bench and walked toward the park's exit, a thought crystallized, one final truth. Love, no matter how tailored, had not destroyed him. It had refined him. He was no longer tethered to what might have been. The horizon stretched wide, and this time it was his alone to claim. Michael stepped into the stream of the city not as a man chasing after someone else's shadow, but as someone who had finally come home to himself.
Dear listeners, thanks for listening to our story. If you were moved by it, please subscribe, like, and comment below. More stories are on the way. Stay tuned.